Free speech in Canada is at an all-time low, and that's thanks to a decade of liberal censorship policies. As I talk to you today, you might think, how is that possible? How can Canada have its free speech rights eroded? But I'm going to break it down for you today, and I'm going to tell you why it is so important, especially as we head into a federal election, to fight back against the Liberals on this point. Now, folks, everything I'm about to say to you is 100% true and 100% important as we head into a federal election. And I need you to help me fight back. I'm going to give you all of the reasons why you need to help me fight back. But to help me fight back, I need to be able to talk to you. So I'm trying to come to you as the Liberals have prorogued Parliament, as they've shuttered Parliament and tried to silence me and my constituents, trying to give you some information. There's a link in the comments. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's in the video description. I need you to click subscribe because it allows me to directly communicate with you and bypass all of the censorship issues that I'm about to break down for you. This is going to be a history of all of the Liberal censorship tools that they've put in place over the last 10 years to suppress different voices, to silence any criticism of their government, and to hold on to power. But I'm also going to explain to you why they're doing this and how it's about to get worse going into a federal election. So please click on that link. Please click subscribe because it is absolutely critical that you get information like this as we head into a federal election. So I want to talk to you about the context for this video, and that is that Canada has a new Prime Minister designate. His name is Mark Carney. He was selected by, a little over 100,000 Canadians in a Liberal leadership review. He's never been elected in a general election. He's never held elected office, and the Canadian media is hardly vetting him. He's only answered a handful of questions. He's never really faced the public, and yet he is going to be, and probably tomorrow, he's going to have his hands on the ultimate levers of power in our country. And there's so many things that he needs to be vetted on that the mainstream media just isn't covering. So again, this is why I need you to click subscribe on the link in the comments. It's a piece I wrote about his coronation this week and some of the things the mainstream media didn't cover. But I want to show you how censorship works in Canada and how the Liberals have progressively suppressed all sorts of different dissenting voices over the last 10 years. So let's start with one of the most recent examples. One of the most recent examples is me. The Liberals have done something called prorogue Parliament. They've actually silenced the voices of every single Canadian because no MP has the right to debate in the House of Commons right now. I don't have the tools available to me, like to use parliamentary committees to order documents or question public officials on things like the Liberals' response to American tariffs. They purposely shut down Parliament so that they wouldn't be criticized. So that's example number one. And it's why it's so critical for you to, people are saying, well, what are you doing? What are you doing to fight back? I'm trying to get you this information. So you have to click on the link that's in the comments and click subscribe. It's free. It allows me to directly communicate with you during this time of crisis. The next three things that the Liberals did to suppress Canadian voices and dissenting voices over the last decade was a series of 3 bills, censorship bills. So the first one is Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act. And it put in place a lot of new regulations on a variety of online platforms that allowed the government essentially to control what you see. It actually interfered in things like algorithms and how these platforms present information to you. It gives government control over that. So that was censorship bill number 1. Censorship bill number 2 was Bill C-18. This is the Online News Act. And what that did was twofold. How it censored you was, first of all, it created news bans, like you can't see Canadian news on platforms like Meta anymore. But it also had the net effect of suppressing new startup journalists, right, who use platforms like Meta to get their information out. So what happened was in Canada, we had a bunch of, startup journalists, startup independent media outlets from all across the political spectrum that were trying to fill news deserts in Canada, especially in underserved markets like Western Canada. But then when the Liberals put in place C-18, what it did was it took away those platforms' traffic drivers like Meta. And so those platforms, they essentially have dried up. They don't have a way to break into the market. And who did it benefit? It benefited legacy media outlets that the government controls in a lot of ways. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I want to get to the third bill. The third bill is Bill C-63, the so-called Online Harms Act. Now, this bill, it proposes a three-headed censorship bureaucracy. It proposed life imprisonment for certain types of speech and preemptive measures for things like thought crimes. And I know this sounds crazy. It sounds like, how can she be saying this about Canada? The government actually tabled this bill, and not only did they do that, they tried to ram it through with no debate just before the House rose at Christmas. And it was only a couple of Conservative MPs that caught on to what they were doing and stopped them from doing this. But they were trying to ram this draconian bill that would have completely chilled speech through the House right before Christmas. And the Liberals will do this again, right? So those are three bills that they put in place. And guys, they don't want me to speak. They don't want you to know this information. And that's why going into a federal election, an election is imminent. I need you to click on the link that's in the comments and click subscribe so that as developments occur, I can directly communicate to you and do my job as an opposition member and scrutinize the government and get that information out to the public. Now, some of you might be familiar with those things. I want to go through the list of all of the other things that the Liberal government have done to suppress speech and silence dissenting voices in Canada over the last 10 years. And then I want to talk to you about what they're going to do next, what they've threatened. So another thing that they've done is they've completely degraded something called the ATIP process. This is the access to information process in Canada. If you're submitting an access to information request in Canada now as a journalist or as a citizen, you will face years-long delays in many situations, full redactions without any way to appeal. They've basically suppressed and circumvented the law that gives the right of Canadian citizens to monitor the government and what they're doing. It's a huge problem that journalists have raised from all political stripe. As a parliamentarian, I often use the ATIP process myself, and it comes back, years later, completely redacted, and they don't care. And why? Because they don't want the public to scrutinize their actions. So prorogation, the three censorship bills, eroding the ATIP process, right? Because they don't want scrutiny. So again, they're trying to do everything that they can to make sure that through social media platforms, through degrading the processes by which we get information, I can't talk to you, that I can't scrutinize their actions. So if you click on the link that's in the comments, it allows me to directly communicate with you. I put information in your inbox. I don't spam you. It is completely free to subscribe. But guys, going into a federal election, the main way that you can help me fight back is by subscribing. Okay, so the ATIP process. Then they did two other things in Parliament that you have to remember are completely egregious in terms of speech in Canada. First, you'll remember several years ago that Parliament ordered the production of documents related to the Winnipeg lab, where there was a controversy about some of the scientists transporting samples of highly infectious virulent diseases to China. And Parliament ordered the production of these documents to see what happened. How did this happen? Was this covered up? How do we make sure that this never happens again? And the Liberals blocked this information to the point where they actually sued the Speaker of the House of Commons. So that is pure suppression of my democratic right as an MP, my constituents' right to have me act on their behalf, but it's also a suppression of speech. So they did this again. They they just completely ignored the will of Parliament before they prorogued Parliament in the fall. There was another production order of documents related to this green slush fund. You'll remember that? That's been memory holed in the mainstream media, right? Again, because they're suppressing this stuff. There was a production order and the government just refused to hand it over. They're like, we're just going to ignore Parliament. Nope. We're not going to give it to you. Doesn't matter. We're just going to completely ignore this and stifle speech. So they've used Parliament. They've ignored the will of Parliament to suppress speech in Canada because they don't want to be held to account. They don't want you to see what they've been doing. So again, click on the link that's in the comments, click subscribe. It allows me to directly communicate with you, right? Now, let's talk about the mainstream media and how they've suppressed independent journalism and dissenting voices, or any voice that wants to criticize the government. The former vice chair of the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, his name's Peter Menzies. He wrote this excellent article in an independent outlet called The Hub a few weeks ago. And it says, Pierre Poilievre, that's the leader of the Conservative Party, has the government-funded media spooked. And he goes through in great detail about how, and the byline, or the header in here is, Canada's media are fighting hard to keep their government subsidies. And so he talks about how, because the Liberals have put in place subsidies, direct cash subsidies for certain mainstream media outlets, that it's essential, and they've coupled that with Bill C-18, it's essentially pushed other dissenting voices outside of any sort of public view. He also talks about how these subsidies, he sort of implies in the article that it incents these mainstream media outlets to do what? Cover the Liberal Party favorably, because they're providing them essentially the money that's keeping them afloat from day to day. So that in and of itself, when you have the government so heavily involved in the financing of mainstream media outlets, then those outlets are incented to only present one side of the argument. They're not incented to criticize the government. And that is actually a suppression of speech in and of itself, right? It's why, there's an accurate statement when people say, well, certain mainstream media, legacy media outlets in Canada have a left-wing bias. Of course they do. And again, if you haven't read this article, I encourage you to do so. You probably won't see it because it's suppressed by Liberal censorship bills. But this is why it's so important for you to subscribe directly to dissenting voices, to opposition voices. And that's why I'm asking you, going into an election, to click on the link that's in the comments or the video description. It's my newsletter. I will directly communicate with you on these types of issues so that you can hear it, in spite of prorogation, in spite of the mainstream media not covering these issues on a day-to-day basis, right? The other thing that, if we talk about the mainstream media that hasn't been largely covered, is the fact that Canada's public broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is funded by the government well over $1 billion. They give their executives major bonuses. A couple of years ago, in 2023, the CBC removed the term objectivity from its journalistic standards and practices. The perception and the criticism on this particular issue is that it's state-funded media, but by taking the term objectivity, or the desire to be objective, out of their practice, it actually, it's a signal that it's going to push Liberal narratives. And we see that. I see that when I do a scrum in the House of Commons. Whenever the CBC asks me a question, it's basically a Liberal talking point that's just, with an inflection at the end, right? They keep repeating the Liberal narrative. They don't have in their terms the requirement to be objective. And that suppresses speech, right? Because I am part of the opposition of Canada, the official opposition in Canada. My job is to hold the government to account. And when you have the government so heavily funding legacy media and putting in place bills to suppress, that effectively oppress and suppress other independent journalism outlet, it suppresses speech in Canada writ large. So again, I ask you to click subscribe on the link that's in the comments or in the video description to allow me to directly communicate with you going into the federal election. And again, I know how crazy this sounds. It's like, this doesn't sound like Canada, but this is exactly what's been happening. And this is what I face as an opposition MP in our country. There's a few other things that I want to talk to you about too that also have showed suppression of speech. I'll go through them quickly. The expulsion of Jody Wilson-Raybould during the SNC-Lavalin crisis. Anytime anybody within the Liberal Party dared to question Justin Trudeau or the Liberals, and we know that Mark Carney, the incoming person, was a senior economic advisor to the party for many years, they kicked them out. That's a suppression of speech. That's a suppression of dissenting voices. There's policies like the Canada Summer Job Attestation for government programs, where they made certain organizations attest to certain principles in order to be eligible for funding. Again, like, this is beyond sort of standard charitable criteria. They were trying to oppress certain types of voices. They might be voices that people don't agree with, but that doesn't mean that in Canada they don't have the right to speech, right? So there's been a lot of different programs like that have been designed to suppress and eliminate voices that are contrary to the Liberal narrative. Then you think about the impact of the Liberals' inaction on things like foreign interference. The Liberals, do you remember, like, again, another thing that's been memory hold, do you remember how the Liberals just dragged their feet on foreign interference for years and years and years? Again, by allowing foreign influences into our country, that actually, especially when it impacts foreign nationals that are now Canadian citizens who want to criticize other governments, that's a suppression of speech as well too, and that's been happening in Canada. Then you go through all of the other issues that happened, particularly during the pandemic, where, you know, the government suppressed any sort of voice that happened that had questions about vaccine mandates. They called everything disinformation and misinformation, as opposed to encouraging constructive public debate. You think about Justin Trudeau's comments about people who chose not to get vaccinated during the pandemic, saying that they hold unacceptable views. Again, this is the leader, the Liberal Party leader, the government of Canada, saying that there are certain types of views that are acceptable to them and certain that aren't. And again, that puts a chill on speech in Canada too. I could go on and on, folks. Maybe I'll even write an article about this, but even it goes down to university research funding in Canada, right? That how the government designed its funding criteria for basic research, how that would have suppressed voices as well too. There are so many things that the Liberals have done to suppress dissenting voices in Canada that going into a federal election, it is going to be so much harder than it was in previous years after a decade of Liberal censorship to get any sort of messaging out. Now, here is the kicker. Why is this important? Peter Menzies, the former vice chair of the CRTC that wrote that article that I mentioned, he tweeted out something really profound today. And he said, the last CBC story, the Canadian Broadcasting Story Online, that contains the word Brookfield, was February 26. Now, why is Brookfield important? Brookfield is the company that the incoming Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, chaired, who he still hasn't disclosed any of his financial assets. We don't know about a lot of the things that he did with the company, but there's been a lot of really negative stories about the company in the press lately. For example, the Financial Times, a very venerable financial media institution, published this story a few days ago. How much does Brookfield really make? And it's a long expose. Questioning Brookfield's accounting practices, their taxation practices. And of course, Mark Carney was the chair of the board during a lot of the activities that article undertakes. Yet you don't have the legacy media questioning him about this. It's only like on X and other platforms that you see people questioning him. Some of the international media do. There's a story in the Telegraph, a UK paper, that says Canada is about to discover Mark Carney is the man with the reverse Midas touch. The rock star former governor of the Bank of England has a trail of destruction behind his glossy jobs. Yet here in Canada, Parliament is prorogued. We can't ask questions about him. We can't litigate him in committees. We have 3 censorship bills that have been suppressing voices like mine. And we have direct media subsidies that incent legacy media articles not to question the governing Liberal Party. So again, you have this environment of censorship that prevents dissenting voices, that allow, with the hope of, the establishment wanting the Liberals to cling to power in spite of their decade of failure in affordability, the housing crisis, crime crisis, a broken immigration system. They want these guys to stay in power because that's where their bread is buttered, right? So again, this is my pitch to you guys. As we go into a federal election, I need to be able to directly communicate with you in a hurry and quickly and through these censorship bills. So if you click on the link that's in the comments or in the video description, it allows me to directly communicate with you. Now, folks, I want to reemphasize something that I don't think has gotten enough attention at all in Canada. How is it going to get worse? There are 2 things that have happened in the last several weeks that every Canadian needs to wake up to. First of all, you had a senior Liberal, and this was reported in Global News, saying that essentially making a call to outright ban the platform X. He said, the federal government, and this is from a Global News article, the federal government must make sure that they don't screw the thing up, that they make sure that we aren't denied our rightful place to make our own choices in the next election. So he's making an argument that, you know, one of the places where there is dissenting voices and holding government to account, like the platform X, other social media platforms do this too, YouTube, others. But he's making the case, the senior Liberal is making a case that X should just be banned outright, okay? Now, keep in mind, this is the same party, again, that tried to ram through C-63, the online harms bill, so-called online harms bill, the draconian censorship bill that had thought crimes put in it. They tried to ram it through the House right before the House adjourned for Christmas. Now, the other thing that has not gotten nearly the attention that it deserves is that the current heritage minister just weeks ago talks about almost increasing 79% more on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation because it's a way to counter misinformation. And whenever a Liberal says misinformation, what do they mean? They mean voices that hold the government to account, that hold the party to account. Not only did she say that it should be increased by 79%, but she also said that Parliament shouldn't have a vote on this, that any funding to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation should be put into sort of this separate accounting process that doesn't really go through parliamentary scrutiny. That's insane, folks. That is something that, like, when you put all of this story together, and the reason why I did this long video today was to show you that these guys have an agenda, and it is to silence any voice, regardless of political stripe, on the left or on the right, that dare question them on their scandals, on their inflationary spending, on their censorship regime. They want to censor us. They want to hold on to power. And that's, you know, that's not what it means to be Canadian. And these guys lately, they're trying to wrap themselves in the flag, but they can't do that while they're opposed to the principles of free speech. So this is what's going to happen in the election. The Liberals want to call an election as soon as possible so that Mark Carney can't be scrutinized. He wants Canadians to think that everything that's happened in the last 10 years is Donald Trump's fault. That's what Mark Carney wants Canadians to think. And they are hoping and praying that if they go to an election quickly and that the mainstream media holds the line, that Canadians aren't going to realize that this guy is like the senior architect of some of the most disastrous policies that the Liberals instituted that bankrupted our country over the last 10 years. They don't want Mark Carney to be associated with the problems that he created that you're paying for now. So folks, as we head into a federal election, I beg you, I plead with you, they have done everything that they can to silence voices like me. And if you're watching this and you've been questioning the government, to silence voices like you. So how can you help me fight back? What am I trying to do? I'm trying to get this information out to you. I'm trying to show you exactly what the Liberals are doing. I've written an analysis on Mark Carney's speech. You know, I've been in politics a long time. I understand how these things work, and I'm trying to get this information to you beyond what you're going to see in the CBC or on CTV. So if you click on the link that's in the comments, click subscribe, tell others to subscribe, share this video. It'll allow me to communicate with you during a federal election and beyond. You know, hopefully the Conservatives win a majority government and these disastrous bills and stuff can be repealed. The Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has committed to repealing these bills so that we can restore speech in Canada. But until that day happens, and I hope it happens, we have to fight. We have to fight the Liberals, and you can't fight unless you have the information to do it. So you have my commitment to communicate with you on things that I see, to come to you in venues like this. But, you know, the Liberals will try and control platforms like this. They already have, right, with these bills. So please click on the link that's in the comments. It bypasses all middlemen. It allows you to directly communicate with you and get information out to you. And that's my commitment to you. Share this video. Working hard for you. Have a great day.